nice to hear Kyo talk about the mentoring kind of relationship that we had because here at Michigan, John Campbell was a person who played that role in my career. And so it comes around, you know? So it's great. And I'm sorry that today's film won't have any sex in it to compete with the law school. There's hardly anything tamer than Japanese school kids walking to school. But hopefully it will still be interesting to you. And this film showed on PBS stations around the country last June and May. So it's kind of produced with the PBS in mind. And so if it's the aesthetic with a lot of talking expert heads is not to your flavor, keep in mind that that was the audience that we were aiming for. And we also are now taking it to various campuses and locations to share it at screenings like this. And so today, the film is about 56 minutes long and contrasts the United States with Japan and the basic puzzle introduced in the abstract that you saw for today's talk is how is it that Japan still has 98% of its elementary kids walking to school every day, mostly without their parents, while the United States has people increasingly giving up on the idea that kids can go to school any way other than their parents driving and dropping them off at the doorstep. And this is a simple puzzle on the one hand. On the other, I think what we try to do in the film is show how it reflects deeper puzzles about how people get engaged in their local communities. Sustaining that system in Japan involves lots of people working to keep the streets safe enough for children. So how did that happen? Whereas in the United States, many parents have just kind of given up that anything they could do could keep their streets safe enough for kids. So that's a deeper puzzle that hopefully the film will bring home to you, and we'll talk about some more in remarks after I show you a couple of clips. I'm showing you the clips that are mostly about the Japan part of the story, and if you want to see more of the American side of the story, you'll have to borrow the film, which is owned in the library, so you can see the whole thing. Okay, you're going to do the lights for me here?
Father, thanks for this good day and for the food that you provide for us. And bless us.
学校がある日だったら行ってもいいですかね。
Sorry. 難しかくないあれ。
Every weekday, all over the world, families start the day by getting kids ready to go out the door and off to school. But the way our children travel to school is not the same.
1年生にはみんな配られるんですけれども、ランドセルカバー、この黄色、目立つような黄色をつけて、みんな1年生はみんなこれをつけます。どちらかというともう車に注意を促すようなまだ小さい子たちですので、すごく目立つようにこの動きとかが分かるように多分つけるんだと思います。
小学校1年生の子は一人で通うにはちょっと私たちのお家から学校までは小学校1年生が歩くと30分ぐらいかかるので、1年生は少し大きい子と一緒に行くように 親がこうフィックスしてそして行くようにしますね。
二軍線かな、マリ
いや違うよ一軍線で。
青具は割と小さい子を見るのが得意というか、そして責任感が割とあるので、走りすぎたりすると注意をしたり、車がたくさんあるところでは車を避けるようにっていうような指示をするんだと思います。
細い道とかで車が来たら指示を出して横に動くようにとか、やっぱり道を開けてあげて横に行くように指示を出す。
まず家出てそこのところ曲がってマックの方に行って曲がって蕎麦屋さんのところを通っていってでまた坂道登ってパン屋さんの方に行って大磯小学校に。
In Japan, 98% of children walk to school.
聞くところによるとやはり1時間かけて行くようなところもあるみたいですね。だから私たちのところで30分というとそんなに驚かれはしないぐらいの距離ですね。
In mountainous and rural areas where children would have to walk more than an hour to school, the Japanese government provides school buses. But that adds up to only 2% of all Japanese elementary students. All of the rest walk to and from school every day without an accompanying parent.
And I think I know what you're going to guess, but it may not be right. Where you feel like you're flying, where it makes you feel like you're flying. It's kind of interesting, for me to be able to take them to school, which I actually do enjoy. That 10 minutes in the car has kind of turned out to be, we've made memories of all things, which, I wouldn't have thought about that, but we have.
Well, you're above the ground, you're more or less
But you're
floating.
not actually flying, though.
I know.
Mason, our principal, Mr. Brandstetter, has said that, well, when they designed the school, he was pushing for the entrance to the school to be at the very far end of the turnaround. You don't want to drive past the entrance, so it is a little tricky getting parents to actually pull past where the door is. That's the holdup sometimes. He does a lot of the, motioning on, because the turnaround, it is really long, but if everybody stops to let their kids off by the front door, then it creates quite a backup.
You generally feel unlucky when you have to pull all the way to the end.
Yeah, like really, I gotta keep going.
Okay, well, we should probably pull all the way forward, but there's no other cars. Okay. Love you, sweetie. Yeah.
I don't believe that there are any kids that walk to school. I'm not even sure if they would be allowed to. I mean, I guess that would be a parent thing if you'd let your kid walk on that busy street. But coming from either direction, they would have to cross over a pretty major highway, even if it was at a light. So I believe that all kids either ride the bus or are dropped off by parents.
In the United States, very few children walk to school. 38% travel to school on school buses. The biggest portion, 50%, are driven to school by a parent.
Yeah, there's a reason there's a term soccer mom, because you're always carting your kids somewhere. It's not like we live close enough where they can walk to the school for their basketball practice.
I do wish, to an extent, that life was structured different, where there was more freedom and flexibility for kids to be mobile and be involved in things where it wasn't constantly requiring driving and being the taxi service. That's what we are. We're taxi service.
Every country that's had universal primary education has started it at a time when, in terms of wealth or technology, the only way that the children could go to school was on foot. That's the way it happened in Japan. That's the way it began in the United States. You think about the one-room schoolhouse on the prairie. Those kids were going to school on foot. But quite early in our history, we started thinking of getting to school on foot as kind of a old-fashioned thing to do.
A lot of changes in schooling and school transportation in the U.S. are made for, really progressively minded intentions. People are trying to do something that helps people of all classes and races have more access to education. And so the federal government is involved in helping purchase school buses at that time to bring kids into those schools.
But the majority of American children still lived in cities and towns and attended nearby schools that could be reached easily on foot.
So the 1920s city through the 1950s city, which is really the kind of high mark of American urbanism, almost everything could be done by walking. The car was then a weekend activity or getting someplace special.
Their mother has shown them the safest route to walk to and from school.
The earliest planning for neighborhoods and what really guided a lot of the post-World War II development was actually an idea of schools at the center of communities and schools within reasonably walkable distances. So in those, 1950s and 60s suburbs, there generally were sidewalks and there were crosswalks and those types of infrastructure available for kids to get to school.
Every day, millions of children go to school.
As late as 1969, when the government completed a comprehensive survey on how children travel to school, half of American kids were still walking or biking. But by 2009, when the government completed its most recent survey of how children travel to school, just 13% were walking or biking. Children walking alone has become such a rare sight in many American communities that families who let their kids walk home from the park have run into resistance from neighbors and the police.
2 police cars pulled up claiming that someone called them over because of 2 kids walking around alone.
They put the kids in the police car and they kept them there for 2.5 hours.
The Métifs were subjected to an investigation by Child Protective Services that threatened to remove their children from their care.
If they're old enough to walk next door to the neighbor's house, if they're 10 or 11 or 12, that's fine. But they shouldn't be wandering around in a park by themselves unsupervised until they're much older.
It's really the only way that children can possibly develop kind of independence and resilience and confidence that we expect them to have as adults. To us, this is an old-fashioned way of raising your kids, not some new crazy idea.
Yet the Métifs were forced to sign an agreement that they would not leave their children unattended. How did the United States and Japan end up in such different places?
After World War II, Japan was a very poor country, so at the very moment when they're just rebuilding their cities, they decided to extend universal education to the middle school, all the way to 9th grade. They were spending all the spare money that they had just building schools.
The Japanese decided they couldn't afford school buses.
So in the 1950s, the Japanese government instructed their schools to come up with tsugakuro, a route to school that was safe enough for the children to navigate on their own without parental escort. The Japanese government was committed after World War II to equality of educational opportunity. It would be unfair if the rich kid had their parent drop them off at school and the poor kid had to continue walking for an hour. So they instructed the schools to ban parental drop-off and arrange for all of the children to walk to school.
Of course, like the United States, Japan has changed a great deal since then. The cities have grown tremendously. Most Japanese families have one or more cars, so traffic is worse. And there have been some sensational crimes that have victimized children.
私たちが、子どもの時には、今のように地域の人たちがこうその登校時間に外に出て見守るっていうシステムは多分なかったんですね。
There's a sense that when there's a threat, what you should do is pull yourself together as a community to respond to that threat. So I think if Japanese mothers called and said, we don't think our children are safe on the route to school, and the local officials said, okay, what we're going to do is call the local associations and we'll have people lining the streets. Or we have a walking committee that will go through and check every intersection and check every dark fence. That's what the Japanese mothers would expect. Japanese are proud to have a safe society. They view that as liberating. And so the things we would think of as sacrifices of time that are unreasonable, they think they understand that as the cost for creating a safe society, and they value it.
Japan is interesting to compare to the United States because they have had almost as much population growth as the United States did during that same period. So a large part of Japan was settled during the era of the automobile, during a period in which Japanese families were also buying a car. And today, virtually every Japanese family has at least one vehicle. And yet, they've organized their suburbs to look very different than ours. All over the suburbs in Japan, you find people doing their daily errands on foot or by bicycle, instead of just jumping in their car for every errand.
千原台はまだできてほとんど20年ぐらいですね。この地域は、公団というガバメントカンパニーですね、そこが作った非常に計画された、町なんですね。で町の真ん中を遊歩道がドーンと通っていて、で全ての学校はその遊歩道沿いに作られています。私は8年前にここに引っ越してきて、で最初は私の娘が別の学校に通ってたんですけども、5年前に新しい学校ができるという機会に巡り合ってですね、で学区がこちらになったので、そういう縁もあって私自身がこの学校そのものを作るというコミッティみたいなものに参加したんですね。必要な横断歩道とか、それからまだついてないですけども信号をここにつけてほしいとか、そういうことを市に要望していって。
友達と一緒に歩くこと、要するに仲間と一緒に人間関係を作ること、歩くことによって一緒に歩いてくることによってそういった人間関係ができるという日本の昔からの伝統ですね。そういったことで車があっても車では送らない、そして街も歩けるようにそういった作りをする。
School siting in Japan, ever since they made this commitment that the kids should walk to school, has been done with the idea that they need to be evenly spaced so that the communities, residences around them can easily walk to school. Japanese schools sit on pretty tiny plots of land, and the schools are typically 3 stories tall. They frequently have none or very little parking. So they squeeze the entire enterprise of a school on a piece of land that can fit into various little corners of Japanese communities in the middle around the residences.
But Japan has not been immune from challenges of increased traffic. Many once tranquil neighborhoods have seen an increase in traffic as population in the area has grown and more people drive. Japanese parents do worry about the danger of vehicles.
下月公園の近くの大きい横断歩道、今は信号がないところ、そちらの交差点では以前車同士がぶつかったり、はい、そういう大きな事故が3回ほどありましたかね。はい。
家から横断歩道が見えますもんで、ところが15年、16年だんだん子供が増えたですね。これはやっぱり危ないなと思いまして、私は16年の4月から一応会長を受けてましたもんで、そこでじゃあ交通ボランティア作ろうと。
朝7時、10分から、45分には一番遅い子が通過します。それが毎日です。
Across Japan, Parent-Teaching Association volunteers also play an important role keeping the walking route safe.
私は地区委員会というのにお手伝いさせていただいてたんですけど、みんな各自一人の子に対して1回役員をやっぱりやるという、みんなで協力するという決まりがあって、下の子がまだ小さかった、生まれてすぐだったので2年目だったので協力しやすいやつをやらせていただいたんですけど、地区委員というのは地域の危ない箇所だったり、朝のパトロールだったりとかやらさせていただきました。
危険箇所マップですね。危険箇所マップというのを、毎年、作っています。でこれは登下校の安全とだけにかかわらず、例えば空き地で草がぼうぼうに生えてて、もうそこなんかはこう紛れて入ったら危ないとか、車を飛ばすところだとかで、これを各家庭に配って見てもらう。それから子どもたちにもこれを説明する。
When necessary, the PTA also follows up by contacting the local authorities to ask for a list of infrastructure improvements that address safety concerns.
I've seen this in other places where I was visiting a local politician. I was trying to interview her. She was a member of a local assembly, and her phone was ringing off the hook because women from the neighborhood were calling to report that there was an issue with trash, to report that they had seen something strange going on with kids, that there was an issue with traffic on a particular road. And then she's going to report this to ward officials. You know, why hasn't that barrier on that busy street to protect the sidewalk been fixed? Why is there still trash there? Who are these people making noise in the night on this street corner?
The final group working to make sure children are able to walk safely to school in Japan are the teachers and administrators of the school.
学校は家から出た時から学校の責任ということ。そして学校から出たら家に帰るまで学校の責任という制度と、通学路制度というか安全に配慮するために黄色の旗を持って交差点に立って安全に渡るように朝勤務時間外から朝早く立ってもらってます。さっきガヤガヤとしてやったんですが、あれは1年生から6年生までが集団で通う時に安全のために教師が班を決めて登校させるという訓練、班作り、グループ作りをしてます。
At the end of the first day of first grade, teachers line up the children by neighborhood and talk to them about how to walk home safely. The first week, they lead the children home to waiting mothers, who meet them part way. But by the end of that week, they're released to walk home without a teacher or parent.
現在776名いますが、交通事故は通っている間には1件もありません。それから不審者に会ったりとか、そういったことも起きてません。
The big flip starts in the 70s and early 80s is when we start to see the rates of walking decline substantially and the number of people driving their children to school go up a great deal.
What caused American parents to pull their children off the streets increasingly since then was not just traffic, but the fear of crime.
I'm not even sure if we lived close enough or where it was safe if I would let my kids anymore. You know, 20, 25 years ago, I think probably, but now it's like I don't trust the creeps that are out there in society, you know, that are they going to get there?
By widely varying estimates, anywhere from 6,000 to 50,000 missing children are presumed to be victims of stranger abduction.
There is a kind of intense coverage during this period of abductions of children. And they are random abductions, right? It's not just the abduction of a child by someone that child knows, which is the majority of them.
Holly Ann Hughes of Staten Island has been missing since July of 1981.
Went to the store about 9 o'clock at night, 9:30 at night. Just disappeared.
I mean, for me, the knowledge of that was tied to the beginning of America's Most Wanted, which created this kind of sense that the bad guys were everywhere, crime was everywhere.
Okay, let's go. Let me tell you something, bro. You're in big, big trouble.
We have a deep cynicism about the capacity of our communities to keep us safe from the threats. So our response is, I'm not going to let my child be there anymore. I'm going to be right at the door of the school with my big car, which is metal, and they're going to be in it and they're going to be safe.
Well, when no one knows anybody, when they're separated by huge lawns and they never emerge from those lawns outside of their automatic garage door opener, everyone's suspect. And so I think the very structure built to insulate people from their fears actually added to their fears because there was very little contact with the people around you, so everyone was potentially dangerous.
The fear of crime was both a cause and a consequence of the continuing waves of suburbanization in the United States that were pushing Americans further and further out into the exurbs.
And so what you have by the 1990s is not just suburbanization, but what we've begun to call sprawl. And the amount of time people spend in cars begins to expand even more. At the same time, people's fears of the city, I think, begin to expand. The idea of the city is a dangerous place.
Japan is known for a low crime rate, but children have been abducted there too.
Well, certainly the most notorious case of this was in 1988 and 1989, 4 girls in Saitama Prefecture between the ages of 4 and 7 were kidnapped and then killed by a serial murderer by the name of Miyazaki Tsutomu. Miyazaki then sexually violated their corpses and drank the blood of one of the victims. It was an absolutely horrendous crime that, of course, shocked the entire country.
I think the most disturbing cases came in 2005. A little girl named Yuki went missing on her way home from school. And in her case, her body was found the next day on a mountainside. And the perpetrator was not found until this year, about 10 years later. So the Japanese public, after this, was incredibly worried about the safety of their children. You had the kind of tabloid magazines playing up all the dangers to your child on the typical route to school. And I found it interesting to compare how the Japanese reacted to that pair of incidents in 2005 with the way Americans reacted to a string of child murders and abductions that began in the 1970s. In the US case, we saw many parents say, after these cases, I'm not going to let my kid walk to school. I'm going to put him on the school bus. I'm going to drive.
I think the Japanese response is they're afraid. I think they tend then to reach out to each other in the community because they have these networks and because they believe that's how it's done. If there was a breakthrough, it was because there weren't enough people watching. So you need more people around to see what's going on. And if something like that happens, you can be sure that the phones of local elected officials and of civil servants will be ringing off the hook.
The Japanese response in this case is interesting because they didn't insist that the government provide school buses. They didn't insist that the schools allow them to drive their child to school. They saw this as a public good, the ability of kids to walk to school safely, that needed to be defended. So one of the things they did in many communities was organize something called the Hachisan Undo. Residents, frequently retired local residents, would agree to step outside their doors when the kids are passing by in large numbers, just to keep more eyes on the street and reassure everybody that we're all in this together and we're going to keep these kids safe.
Japanese communities employed two strategies. The first was to reassure the public by turning out a large number of volunteers, estimated to total 80,000 nationwide in the aftermath of the 2005 abductions. The second strategy was to emphasize the deviance of the individual that was behind the danger, not the danger of an entire class of people. And the police were going to catch this individual.
I think the general expectation is that those people are actually quite rare. So I don't think that the general assumption is that we have to do something to stop our children from being out in the streets. Instead, it's we have to figure out what produces this small set of monsters and make certain that they can't be in a position to terrorize my kids or anyone else's.
And volunteers, again, were fully involved in the effort to find and catch the individuals who were threatening their children in this way.
Japanese neighborhood associations are utterly ubiquitous, anywhere from major cities to small towns. Well, the neighborhood associations do a whole lot of stuff. Safety in neighborhoods is one of them, partly because there's always an expectation that there's going to be eyes in the street. The Japanese police work very closely with neighborhood associations. They'll try to make certain they know people, and they'll try to make certain they work with the heads of the local neighborhood association to ensure that if there is suspicious activity that's taking place anywhere, that the police are made aware of it more or less right away.
Japanese pay a price for all of this street monitoring, both in terms of the time they put in as neighborhood volunteers and in terms of the limits it places on their ability to cut corners on their social obligations.
Well, so there are two sides of it, right? And I've experienced both. There's the street monitoring where, and this happens to me because I don't wake up on time, where you're running out with your trash at the last minute and you're trying to stick it in the wrong barrel or the wrong pile, and there's some woman there, telling you shouldn't do this. And that's very stressful. On the other hand, I can walk down the street at any hour of the day, and I feel safe. And that's a huge thing. If you talk to Japanese citizens, they are often quite amusingly cynical. So Japanese women who volunteer to help manage the streets in some way are in no way unclear about the fact that they're providing free labor to produce a public good. That said, they are also committed to producing that public good because they believe that that's part of their duty to their home and their family, that their community is better when that public good is available.
The Japanese consider this system a public good because it allows children to explore their neighborhoods and gradually develop a sense of their own autonomy and responsibility toward each other.
自分たちの中で多分ここまでなら大丈夫だろう、ここまでなら大丈夫だろうというような範囲が自分の中でだんだん広がっていく、自然に広がっていくことが大切だと思いますね。
近所の子が1年生だったら6年生12歳の子が一緒になって連れてくる、要するに面倒を見てあげる、要するに心を育てる、優しい面倒見のいい相手の思いやる心を育てる、そういったところに役立っています。
Finally, Japanese value the system because they have no easy exit options, no easy way to avoid walking on their neighborhood streets.
When you see the number of Japanese who turn out on the first day of school to serve as crossing guards and to help assist the children and be eyes on the street, you might think that this is just something very different from American culture. My view is that this continues today because it's constantly reinforced by the way schools are structured, the way communities are structured, the way people live.
Since neighborhoods were built so that children could walk to school, and Japanese of all ages walk in their neighborhoods daily, retreating behind an automatic garage door opener is not an option for most Japanese. Neither is it easy to sell the family home and move to a safer suburb.
So the Japanese housing market is organized very differently. For a long time, you could not borrow money at the bank to buy an existing home. They have a more pejorative term. They call these existing homes used homes. And they kind of think of them like used cars. That the home is thought of as something that once you drive it off the lot, it's going to be depreciating in value continuously till it becomes worthless about 20 or 30 years in the future. So if you are stuck in your neighborhood because you can't sell that used house, you're going to have a very different attitude when there's a crime or a break-in or the traffic gets worse and you're worried about the safety of your children.
If you're going to be there with the same people for 30 years, 40 years, who knows, that you need to be a member of the organization, at least on paper, which means that neighborhood organizations have a pretty good list of who's there, right? That doesn't mean that everybody gets involved, but it means that the first steps are taken by nearly everyone because they do not expect to be able to leave the community that they're in. And they think they have to cultivate, at least to a minimal level, relationships among themselves that demonstrate that they're good citizens, that they're good community members.
6歳の一番下の子が一人で学校に行くっていうことはとてもやっぱり心配なんですけれども、日本ならではのというか、一人ではない、一人では行くけれども周りにたくさん見守ってくれる方がいたり、また兄弟がいたりお友達がいたりっていうことで、不安もありますけれども、もう任せるという感じですね。
So those were the clips I was going to share with you. So I know I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, so maybe I'll just say a few things to draw out the contrasts that I hope you saw in the film, and maybe reflect a little bit on how I see this as social science research, which is very untraditional way to try to make a contribution to discussions about social scientific phenomenon, to try to put it on a film as a scholar. So the big puzzle here is not so much why do people walk 98 versus 13% to school, it's the civic engagement. How is it that all those Japanese people are motivated to get out there and volunteer to keep their streets safe? Whereas the Americans are so quick to decide that all they can do is throw up their hands and drive their kids to school. I don't give the cultural arguments a whole lot of play there, but I think most people immediately go to an explanation that's centered on these are just very different cultures. America's a culture of individualism. We need the freedom to do what we want. So if we want to be able to drive our kids, we're not about to let the school tell us we can't. And the Japanese are seen as, ever since the rice growing agriculture, they cooperate to do things. And this is just an extension of that. We can talk if you want to about how far that argument goes. I think there's certainly some of that going on in terms of the receptivity of the different populations to the efforts of the schools and the communities to guide their action. But I'm trying to argue against that. And there's another theory that's out there in political science about Japan, which says that Japan has a very powerful state. Back in the pre-war period, the neighborhood associations were organized by the state to try to control people's activities. And the fact that they still exist is partly because they get subsidies from local governments. So the state is still playing a role in keeping the system going. The state wants to control crime and control people's misbehavior, and this whole system serves the state's goals. And the only reason this different happens is that Japan has a strong state and America doesn't. So I'm trying to argue very subtly against both of those arguments and say that there's more of a path-dependent story here where certain structures, like the housing market structure that I described, cause people to, when the first incident happens, once the crime is out of control, it's hard to convince anybody anywhere that you need to let your kids walk, and the government says you have to do that, and the neighborhood association is going to be there for you, so please just let them go. It's hard to do that once the crime is out of control and people's fears have taken over. But the way Japan avoided that fate was by being very sensitive when the first incidents would happen, which they did, of crimes, abductions, traffic getting worse. They're very sensitive to that because they are stuck with the being in their neighborhood. They can't easily sell their house. They're also pretty stuck in their ability to escape via automobile. There's sort of a path-dependent, built environment in Japan where even if lots of parents wanted to drive and drop off their kids at the schools are not located anywhere where you could organize a nice little drop-off circle like you saw in the American case. So how do you overcome that? The kids are going to have to walk to school is the way people think. And if they're going to have to walk to school, we need to do everything it takes to keep them safe. Because of course, if your kids are in danger, everybody's going to volunteer, whether you're an American or a Japanese. So that's a nutshell version of a competing argument that I'm trying to offer in the film. But it's been an interesting experience to go from writing journal articles where you offer your hypotheses, you collect your data, and you try to show your argument in a very methodical way, and the medium of film where you have to try to show certain things with stories and visuals and kind of hint at the explanations. You can't really prove a particular theory, and it leaves a lot more agency to the viewer or the person reading, thinking about these issues, to figure out what's driving this different outcome in the two different places, which I found stimulating, because we try to do that in the classroom with our students. At least I do. I don't try to tie it all up into a nice bow and say, here's the explanation. Just write it down and regurgitate it on the midterm. In my classes, I try to offer alternative explanations. You guys have to weigh this and help figure out what's going on. So why can't we do that in more of our work to reflect the complexity and the fact that most of these big phenomena that we try to explain have complicated multiple causes. So that's some organizing remarks maybe to stimulate some of the Q&A. But of course you can also ask me about anything you saw. I mean, the gender issues are pretty obvious in the film, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have about that. So for many Americans, the question hopefully the film leaves you with is, could we go back? Can you turn back the clock once you've let the path-dependent paths diverge to this degree? So I'd be interested in your thoughts and reactions. Jennifer?
Thank you so much. It's really extraordinarily interesting and really wonderful film. And I have a couple of questions that maybe we can tie together. One, I wondered if these were, you selected obviously suburban neighborhoods, so they're pretty contained. And when I'm in Tokyo, I live in a more urban section, and and it's quite an affluent part of Tokyo, and definitely the mothers are dropping their kids off. And so I wondered about private school versus public school, and also urban versus, more self-contained suburban. And with the demographic changes in Japan and the shrinking number of children, many urban schools are closing down, and so the area of the commute becomes much longer. I in fact see quite a few kids on the trains and subways. So that's an interesting complication. Another, and I don't know if you were conscious of this when you made the film, American parents, in like Happy Valley of all Disney type in Portland, Oregon, were driving their kids up. It's dark, and
Mhm.
you know in Japan there's no daylight savings time, so even in the winter it's quite light, and you know there's a little bit more safety in terms of negotiating streets without sidewalks as
Mhm.
well in Japan, and of course railway crossings that are pretty tricky to negotiate sometimes. And, you know, these kind of issues where the public obviously has to kick in. So the you know the public-private daylight savings time, shrinking populations, urban versus rural, some of these complicated the kind of you know comparative picture that
Mhm.
you do for us in school.
Well, there are a lot of questions in there. Yes, the statistics that I give you are for public schools. So that came from a Ministry of Education official telling me that 98% of the public elementary school students walk to school and into their neighborhood schools. And but you know, I'm struck. Certainly in Tokyo is actually unusual in the degree to which the kids attend private elementaries. Most other parts of Japan, private elementary is a much smaller part of the education market. And in Tokyo, I think most people go there are struck by the fact that there are, even the kids going to private school are navigating the way on their own a fair amount of the time, and in ways that we would never see here, such as crowded trains and busy train stations. And the private school drop-offs, you know, when I was most intimately involved with this is when I lived in Japan for a year, 2000, 2001, so that's kind of old now, when my kid was in kindergarten and then in first grade elementary school. And when she went to kindergarten, we drove her in a bicycle with a little bike seat, right? But some of the wealthier people were dropping off at the kindergarten in big SUVs. So kindergarten is still fair game for parents to drop off if they need to, and they're much more, you know, diverse, and people choose ones that are often further away from home. But elementary school, public, is still close enough to home that there's a sudden change. You know, we went from that to being told on the first day of school by our neighbors, somebody knocked on our door and says, "You guys can't accompany your daughter to school on the first day of school. The sixth grader from upstairs is going to come by and take your daughter to school." And we went along with that. You know, and off she went. We said goodbye in the Genkan, and off she went to school with the sixth grader we never met before. So you know, when you're in Japan, you kind of go with the flow, the way Japanese do. But I think that's part of how Japanese do it too, to the point that they can't imagine another system. Big part of the elementary school experience is going to and from school with your friends and having that independence for the first time. So there's a few reflections on part of your question. Then you also asked about the daylight savings time. Yeah, well, part of the difference in what you saw there was that we were on the first day of school in Japan, so that's April, and we happened to film in Portland, which is pretty far north latitude, in mid-December, which is probably, you know, among the darkest times. So, but it's true that some kids are going to school in the dark all over the country. I'm sure it happens in Michigan. And I think the Japanese have even adjusted the way they keep track of time, not doing daylight savings time, maybe in part because of this. You know, they need the kids to be able to go to and from during daylight. Although the from part is very uneven in Japan, right? Some of you may know Tom Gill in Tokyo, and he watched this and he expressed frustration that we focus so much on the way to school, which is everybody goes around the same time and in groups. And his view as a parent in Japan was that the real scary part for parents is the kids coming home, because they come home at uneven times. Sometimes after dark, after club sports, you know, middle schoolers coming home at 8 p.m. or something. So people do have to navigate. We don't tell all of the complexity of what Japanese parents have to navigate. And some Japanese parents aren't quite comfortable with that coming home in the dark part, so they will go part way and they meet their kids with the car, and they're embarrassed to do it right in front of the school because they're not supposed to, but they meet them part way so that they can take the kid home while still sort of abiding by the school rule. Yes. Yeah.
That I feel safe, but on the other hand, there's this really irritating older woman who tells me I'm dumping my trash in the wrong bin or whatever, and she's always there, and it's there, right? So I think in your first remarks, it's either the strong state or the essential cultural difference. What about the sort of social coercion that works to maintain a kind of system? I know from my own observations and my own experience that form of social coercion, that works within social groups, between social groups, or even institutions like a school.
Right.
Can be felt as tremendously oppressive for people, especially women, whom the burdens are dumped. But, I've always thought about that social coercion. Where does it come from? How does it work? And are you giving it enough kind of attention in your system?
Yeah. Another person that we crossed paths with in Tokyo while we were getting ready to film was Glenda Roberts, who had been, I know that there's several people who are anthropologists in the room, so I'm mentioning a few, but she had done this parent thing, and she kind of objected to our coming to Japan and studying this as possible model of what America might like to do, because she felt that was so oppressive that she and not her male colleagues had to stay home from, go to work late on certain days when she had crosswalk duty. And, it's duty, giri, is the word that goes along with obligation that you're mentioning. And that is a big part of this. The word, I kept using the word volunteers, right, which is an American word, to describe what we were seeing in Japan. And a lot of those Japanese people out in the streets probably didn't consider themselves volunteers. They felt they were there in part because they had to. But I think, I would argue as somebody more on the structural side of these debates that this too is, created by path-dependent structures that reinforce this over time so that people accept that obligation is a reason you do a lot of stuff without complaining. And there, every society has some level where people accept that. They have certain social obligations, and Japan is definitely at the high end in terms of that. But you certainly don't trace it to rice agriculture and some sort of historical thing that has been indoctrinated forever. I think it's reinforced because there are some goods that people can see that they value and they realize that they're contributing to it. So that's I'm referring back to Robin's explanation there for why do people put up with this. They see the news stories from America of these crimes and children abducted and parents who can't trust their kids to get to school safely. They know vaguely of the situation here. And this is one of the things they value most about Japanese society. They don't mind slow growth, even negative growth, even, you know, a lot of other things about Japan that they know are problems, they accept because safety is something that they have that a lot of other societies don't. And that's very valuable. And my view is that a lot of people who do this stuff, even though they probably are not consciously thinking about it, when they're doing it, they're probably grumbling, why do I have to do this again? But they still can rationalize it because there's a good, there's an outcome that they value. It would probably all fall apart if, you know, Japan suddenly became unsafe. And that's one reason Japan is so worried about immigrants, right? How can you sustain this system if you suddenly have people with different cultural backgrounds who don't know about the trash system and things like that? Well, that's a whole nother tangent. But yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think you're right about the demographic change and the retirees, you know, healthy 65-year-olds are a huge pool of volunteer labor for this kind of thing. And I mean, it was interesting that this one guy, he was, I couldn't use very many of his clips because he was so hard to listen to, but his story about how he saw the kids and they were walking in a dangerous crosswalks and he decided he needed to go form a volunteer safety patrol group. You know, they weren't his own kids. It wasn't anybody telling him that because he's a woman or a retiree that he had to do this. It was somebody who just looked out his window, saw a problem, and says, I can be part of the solution. So I agree that the women are asked to do a whole lot here, but I think that there's a broader part of society that is contributing to this achievement, and maybe they can adapt the system to the changing gender roles where more women are working, you know, career jobs with longer hours. And I generally found that the PTAs are accommodating. You know, they grumble too if there's a woman who is so busy with her work that she can't do anything, they will have trouble with that. But they will try to find her, and it's not the dad still, I know. They'll try to find her a job that she can do on the phone on the weekends or something that can be accommodated around her work schedule. So I do think the system is evolving somewhat in response to changing gender roles and demography in an interesting way. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. No, they're definitely, the U.S. number was 13% for the whole country, and that includes large parts of the country where 0% are walking, and then some parts that are partly because they were built longer ago with sidewalks, neighborhood schools, things that we used to value when we thought it was normal for kids to walk to school. We still have a legacy in some neighborhoods. That's probably a big part of the story for Ann Arbor, the infrastructure part, as well as the safety. But the U.S. decided at some point to stop building sidewalks, build the giant schools in the suburbs where no one can reach them on foot because they wanted a big footprint with lots of parking. So there's a lot of the story in the U.S. that is based on infrastructure and not just on safety. So, yeah, we featured Portland in part because people have this impression that Portland is a super walkable place, right? And there are parts of Portland that are where the kids bike. And in the film, we filmed those parts too. So you see the story about America. Some parts are walking and biking, and we have a bike train set to music that's very uplifting at the end, okay? But so you, part of what you didn't see that part because I didn't show that in the clips. But we chose the family you saw from Portland because they are just outside, just 10 miles away from super walkable downtown Portland are these suburbs that were constructed just like suburbs all around America with the schools that are not walkable at all. Even though Happy Valley is a very low crime place, crime is not the problem. As you might expect with a name like that. Yes? Yeah.
If you are a social engineer who's advising some different countries from the US or somewhere else to create a system like Japan, I think you can say two things. One, just make sure that there's no way that people can do what they want to do. That is individualistic behavior. It must make sense because those are not possible. And to some extent, that's what Japanese culture and society has accomplished. Because some of the examples that you said apply, like housing market, wage increase, housing market structure. Or if I'm from one little town somewhere, because I cannot look for a job on the other side of Japan because I don't have home, which basically prevents me from getting anything. So again, I need to step to the local community which I'm coming from. So all those kind of factors kind of conspire to make it much less easier to try to do whatever you want to do. Now, other elements maybe just to create this psychological maybe fiction or some kind of a belief system so that you fool yourself when cooperation makes sense. So for example, this body of safety, I am really that's important body, but there are many other bodies that could potentially be important. But it seems to me that what's going on in those communities is that PTA mothers and local police and all those people say whatever they want to say to create this kind of mystery or myth that community safety is the utmost importance, which is a good thing for sure. But usually that something else may be important, but somehow there's a social consensus for some reason. Right?
Yeah.
So, and again, and then I think I wouldn't ignore this community symbols or narrative, which may come from some older stories about, older men and older women go somewhere and do all sorts of things for the kids and those kinds of characters and stories. Which kind of reinforce this myth of doing some sacrifice to work with other people and so forth. And Yeah, and interesting, I think you're right. I mean, there's the historical defenders. Those two things are kind of feed to each other. So if you cooperate, if the housing market turns out to be in such a way that it doesn't make sense to buy a house somewhere else because everybody is cooperating. So, I don't need to my words. So anyway, I wonder if is this still abstract argument, or is this something that you kind of reluctantly endorse?
No, you make a very persuasive argument that that is a part of what's going on. Now, I would argue that in most parts of Japan, this narrative has been going on so long that nobody has to consciously reinforce it. You know, it's just a feedback loop, constant feedback loop that we try to sustain this kind of a way of thinking. And not to say there are some people in Japan who challenge this, obviously, but the dominant narrative is dominant enough that it just reinforces itself. But I do think there are room, you know, if I think about downtown Portland, for example, people there are creating a narrative that, you know, walkability is an important value about our place, and people need to be a part of a community that's going to sustain that, so people are volunteering there. And so you can create this kind of narrative in the U.S. too, I think, if you want to. It's going to have to be done more consciously. Yes, so you need to put time into that narrative, and not just assume that if you build sidewalks, they will come. You know, which is the way the government's response to this issue has been to build a lot of sidewalks, and which is a good thing. It's needed, but it's not going to turn the U.S. into anything like what you saw in Japan without addressing the broader fears and the idea that this is a public good. Public space is a public good that people should invest in maintaining. And to me, I do think that there are narratives in American history, in the American past, that value those things, and that could be resuscitated by some social reformers.
Japanese or Chinese are not very good in contributing to public good. For example, literacy. Or when I was a kid, people feel free to say, save from the street and all sorts of things. People become civic. However, I'm not sure if there's great value on social good.
We'll have to talk some more this evening.
I think you have 3 questions, so we'll take them together and then
sure.
we can choose from.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. So, things are much nicer to watch this film in one of my classes, and in that discussion, one thing that kept coming up, came up a bit, your comments about sidewalks, just reminded me, was about disability. There's different ages and things. And I was wondering, I think both of you, I don't know if you about this. Hi. But I was curious, in your interviews in Japan, did anyone talk about that? Like, I mean, how walking itself might be a challenge for people in different bodies.
I'll answer that. Yep.
I was interested to see the lack of technology as part of the conversation on this, particularly mobile technology. Through organizing efforts on the volunteer end, or wayfinding, or tracking safety of children. I'm wondering if you specifically avoided that, or if that is not really something that played a role in your.
Sure. Disability technology. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which is, of course, extremely traumatic, and I think disrupted a lot of narratives about safety, where who's a predator, who isn't. And so I was kind of curious, Dave, when you talked a little bit about, you know, these are exceptional cases, but how do you identify these? I mean, it seems like it's the narrative is sort of forcing you to think outside, you know, a bunch of citizens in spots, where they monitor
Okay. So disability did not come up at all in my conversations as I was working on the film. We didn't see any disabled children in any of the scenes that we were shooting. And I mean, I'm very aware that elderly who have trouble walking upstairs have huge trouble in Japan with the infrastructure. They're gradually putting in more elevators and so forth for public transportation. But the kids, I think there's special buses for the kids in wheelchairs so that it's not assumed that they're going to wheelchair to school. But that didn't happen to come up. Yeah. And then you asked about technology. There was one aspect of the response to the child abductions that we didn't show in the film that I did hear about and discussed briefly in an article version that I wrote, which was some schools, on the way home, this is when parents are the most worried because they don't know exactly when they're coming, right? And so they had some sort of a electronic signal device that they implanted in people's backpacks. And as you walked through the school door, it would send an automatic text message to the parents letting them know your kid is now on the way home. And you didn't have to rely on the kids to make a cell phone call. They automatically knew. So that was pretty innovative technological solution. I don't know how widespread it was. It didn't show up in any of our conversation with the communities where we were filming. But I know that at least some places use that. And the cell phones, I don't have a good feel for whether elementary school kids are allowed to take their cell phones to school today. I would guess not. Somebody been there recently with kids and know that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's not exactly a technological solution, but whistles, you know, and noisemakers are common part of the kids going safely to school. And the safety homes, which we didn't really show here, but some scattered around neighborhoods, some people volunteer that we are going to be a refuge, so that if the kids feel like somebody's following them or after them, they have a sign in front of some people's houses, you can run to this person's house and be safe. So there's other parts of the system we weren't able to show because we didn't necessarily see them right when we were filming. But it has some sort of a more complicated social organization. And then your question was about, remind me real quick, where the threats are coming from. Yeah, Japan's media coverage of crime is interesting because even though crime is rare, if one happens, and especially if it involves children, it is broadcast nationally, right? A child can be hurt in Chicago, maybe it's covered on the local news, but it doesn't make national American news. But in Japan, any incident anywhere in the country, national news. So there is a tendency for the fears to be magnified by the way media covers these things. And how do they identify these potential troublemakers? You know, there's a lot of talk about stranger danger. So kids are coached as part of this being safe to look out for strangers. And, you know, if a stranger comes up to you, don't just get in their car. So some basics, kids know who is stranger and who is not, at least to some degree. But I wonder how they are able to reconcile that with the fact that there are all these people that they probably don't know holding flags and being a safety refuge home who they don't know, but somehow they're supposed to trust those people, but not these strangers. And yeah, it's you know, the broader film, you didn't see a whole lot in here about race in America, but we do take that on in the film. And that allusion to not blaming whole classes of people when an incident happens in Japan was referring by contrast with our tendency here to do exactly that. And you would think it would make it more challenging for Japan because most of the people committing the pedophile incidents are ethnically Japanese, indistinguishable from everyone else. So they nevertheless somehow think they can spot them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.